Lecture 5, Political Turmoil in England and the Colonies. In this lecture, we're going to look at the changing political relationship between the mother country, England, and her North American colonies. As we will see, there's going to be lots of conflict on both sides of the Atlantic. On the left-hand side, we see some conflict going on between the colonies and British officials in New England. On the right-hand side, we see an illustration of the English Civil War. Both of these events will be interrelated. So let's start with letter A, the English Civil War, 1642 to 1649. That's what this whole section is about. We talk about before the war, during the war, and after the war, and its impact on the American colonies. So let's go before the war, the era of benign neglect. From about 1607, when the colonies are first getting started, to about 1660, so mostly the 17th century, the first half of the 17th century, we're going to see that the British Crown, on the right there, from Schoolhouse Rock, is not very interested in her North American colonies along the coast, what you see in red there. Mostly the British Crown is interested, and Parliament itself are interested in what's going on in the Caribbean, all those little red dots. The reason they're interested in the Caribbean is because there's lots of sugar there, and they're a much bigger money producer than the floundering poor colonies on the Atlantic seaboard that really haven't taken off yet. And so the king is not really interested in what's going on in, like I said, the east coast of the will be the United States. In fact, the king has very little to do with the founding of all but one of the colonies. He is somewhat involved in the founding of Georgia, but all the others, the colonies are going to be founded by religious dissenters. They're going to be founded by private people looking to make some money, by corporations, and they really don't have too much to do with the king himself. And so the relationship between the colonies in North America and the British Crown is almost non-existent in the first half of the 17th century. Because of that, the colonies are going to ignore the navigation laws. It's an example of mercantilism we'll talk about later. But the navigation laws, or the orders in council, are a set of laws that the Parliament passed. And the Parliament in England wanted to use the colonies to make money for the mother country, and they put in a whole bunch of laws that kind of limited the colonies' trade. But the colonies never followed these laws because England just didn't care enough about their North American colonies to really enforce the laws. So from the very beginning of the colonies in North America, the king politically is not paying attention to them, and economically, even though there's laws on the books, he's still not paying attention to them either, because they're just so poor and just barely struggling to survive. The king doesn't feel like he needs to enforce any of his laws. Because of this neglect, which benign neglect means good neglect from the colonial viewpoint, because of this neglect, whether we're talking about Virginia or Massachusetts or you pick the colony, the original 13 colonies got used to making their own laws. They didn't have to worry about what Parliament tells them to do or the king because they're being ignored. And so we get a long-standing tradition of having self-rule among the colonies. Oh yes, they say they're loyal to the king, and the king says he has control over them, but not in reality. And so each of the colonies will have their own assembly, and they'll make their own laws, and they'll importantly tax themselves. And for the most part, the British don't even tax their colonies because there's just not that much wealth to be generated. And so we're kind of setting up for the American Revolution in the next unit of study, is that we have this long tradition in the American colonies of self-rule and neglect from England. Now let's go ahead and talk about some events in England. In England, there's going to be a civil war that goes on from 1642 to 1649. The King of England, a guy by the name of Charles, he is going to fight with Parliament over taxes. The King of England is a fairly poor king, as kings go, and going all the way back to Magna Carta, the king has to get permission from England from the English Parliament to raise taxes, and he has asked again and again and again. He's been fighting many wars, the English crown has, with France and Spain, and eventually Parliament says enough. We're not going to let you raise taxes anymore. And so the king says, yes, you are, and they say, no, they're not. And so the King of England fires Parliament. He just sends them all home, and he says, I'll raise taxes without you. Of course, that's taxation without representation, which Parliament and the English people have a right to. And so we see that a civil war will embroil England. They'll be busy killing each other in big numbers in England, which means that they pay even less attention to their colonies in North America. On the previous slide, we had talked about the era of benign neglect, and that's going to continue. Before the Civil War, England didn't care about the colonies, and now during the Civil War, they certainly don't care about the colonies because the English are busy trying to see who's going to win the Civil War back in England. And so the colonies are a little bit scared about this because Mother England is not there to protect them. If the French or the Dutch attack or Native Americans attack, there's nobody to send troops to reinforce colonial militias. And so the colonies think they must defend themselves. So what they do is some of the colonies in New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth, they'll form the New England Confederation. It's founded for mutual protection against the Indians, French, and Dutch attacks. It's a pretty dangerous world out there, and don't think that the Dutch, French, and Native Americans aren't going to take advantage of this civil war in England to maybe attack and wipe out or steal some of these colonies from the British. And so it's a league of mutual defense, basically. It also was formed to help recapture runaway indentured servants. So if you're an indentured servant in Plymouth and you run away before your time is up to Massachusetts Bay, that was a real problem in the past. These colonies did not get along at all. They all were founded for different reasons. But now if you're in the New England Confederation, if you're an indentured servant and you run away to Massachusetts Bay, they will extradite you back. And so we see that the colonies, for the first time, even though it's just 3 of them, they start to act as a unit. And this is an important step for later on, again, when we get to the Revolution, is that we're seeing as we go through time now, from now until 1776, we're going to slowly, but we're going to see growing colonial unity. Colonies are going to slowly come together more and more and stop acting like 13 separate colonies and eventually act like, well, to some extent, one nation. So the English Civil War will end in about 1649, and not important for our purposes really for this class, but England, the Civil War will end and the forces of Parliament will win. They'll actually behead the king, and then they're going to be led by a dictator, basically, a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And he rules England for a while, and then he'll pass away, he'll die, and then eventually the people of England want their king back. There's been too much chaos and anarchy. By tradition and history, they have had a king before, and so people are saying, look, no more chaos, no more anarchy, we want the way things used to be. And so we have this thing called the Restoration, where we put a king back on the throne. So Charles II, the son of the beheaded Charles I, is back on the throne, and then eventually we'll have another King James II, so forth and so on. And so we see that the Restoration is because we're restoring the monarchy. Now, how does this deal with the colonies? Well, Charles II, he still needs money. I mean, that has never been resolved. Charles I needed money to dissolve Parliament, and we see how that ended in this picture for Charles I. He lost his head. But when Charles II comes back on the throne, he still needs money, but he knows enough now not to ask Parliament for it, because if he does, he might lose his head as well. And so how is a king to get money if he can't tax his own people in England? Well, that's pretty easy. You start taxing the colonies. So this is when the era of benign neglect between England and her colonies in North America comes to an end. Because the king now, and the new king of England, Charles II, he needs money to raise troops, those kinds of things. And then the guy who follows him, James II, is going to need money as well. And so what we're going to see is that the king of England now starts to focus on his colonies in North America. Which, 1, because he needs money, and 2, because by the time we get to the 1660s, the later half of the 17th century, those North American colonies have started to prosper. Their people are living, they're starting to find economic systems they can use, crops they can grow, tobacco in the south, shipbuilding in the north, and so they're starting to generate enough wealth, and their population is increasing, like we said in the last set of notes, and so they're worthwhile taxing now. And so for those 2 reasons, the king needs money, and the colonies are starting to make money, he starts to pay attention to them, and he's going to control them a little bit more forcefully. To do this, he creates an organization called the Dominion of New England. The Dominion of New England is going to be an organization that is created to help the king assert more authority and raise taxes over his colonies, specifically in New England. So let's talk about that. Section B, the Dominion of New England, created in 1686. Its purpose, as I said before, is to raise money for the king who doesn't want to tax his own people in Parliament. And so here we see the colonies are going to be part of the Dominion of New England. It's not just New England, it's a few other colonies too. It's all the colonies you see on the right that are underlined in red. And so here is our second time that colonies have come together. Now, the New England Confederation was brought together, if you remember, because the colonies wanted it. Here, the Dominion of New England is created to bring colonial unity, but it's forced upon the colonists. They don't really want this to happen. And so it's still colonial unity, but for a different reason than the New England Confederation. Next, to raise taxes, the king is going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts, the navigation laws, also sometimes called the Orders in Council. We had talked about that before. And these are laws that control colonial trade so that the money that's generated from this trade will go back to Mother England. And that's how the king is going to get his money. He's going to control the trade of the colonies with the rest of the world. We also talked about its forced colonial unity. And so if we take a second here, these navigation laws are part of an economic philosophy that's going on in Europe that's going to be applied to the colonies. It's called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is, like I said, it's an economic theory, and it's something that was very popular at the time. People don't believe, economists don't believe in mercantilism anymore, but they did at the time. And so let's talk about this theory. Let's pretend to visualize the theory that all the wealth in the world, every single bit of it, every coin, every piece of land that has value, every piece of clothing, everything in the world that has value, that is worth wealth, is finite. It can be measured. So let's think of it as a pie chart, right? And in that pie chart, all the wealth of the world will fit, right? However, if we were to draw, so let's go back just a second. If we were to draw, so what I want you to do is think about dividing this pie chart up into pie pieces. And we have a piece for England and a piece for Spain, France, China, Japan, whatever. The whole pie chart is divided up by country, and each country has a piece of the pie. Well, let's think about the implications of this. Now, Europe believes in kind of a compete or die mentality at this point. England is competing with Spain and France for dominance. Spain and France are competing with their rivals for dominance. Portugal is competing. And so it's very competition-based economic theory. So let's imagine our pie pieces again. Let's say England has a very thin slice of the wealth of the world because they're not a very wealthy country. But let's say they start enforcing the Navigation Acts. Let's say they start raising tax revenue by controlling colonial trade, which means that England's wealth will increase because they're taxing their trade. And so their pie piece gets bigger. But all the wealth is finite. It can all be measured. It all fits in this pie piece. So if England's pie piece gets bigger, that means somebody else's pie piece, like France's, must get smaller. So you see how this fits into the competition theory that Europeans have. If I succeed, my enemy has to fail. And so this idea of mercantilism, it's something that was driving colonization, but it's also going to be driving English economic policy here. They believe that if they start taxing their colonies, not only is England going to get rich because there's more money flowing in, but that also means that her rivals, Spain and France, will get poorer, weakening them. And so this is a justification for enforcing the Navigation Acts. So let's look at those Navigation Acts. What did they actually do? Well, they're designed to limit trade from the colonies to other nations. Think about it. If we let, Massachusetts, an English colony, trade directly with France, then France is going to be benefiting from the English colonies, not Mother England. Some of New England's products, some of her trade is going to be ending up, that money, that trade is going to be ending up in French hands, which means France's pie piece gets bigger and England's must get smaller. And England did not create colonies just to benefit her rival France. And so we have to limit trade. According to mercantilism, we have to limit our colonies' trade just with England, right? So the colonies exist to benefit the mother country. Think of them as an ATM machine. They were created to create wealth for the mother country, and we are damn well not going to let our colonies trade with France or Spain or Portugal or the Dutch because we want the wealth coming to us, not our enemy. That's how they thought about mercantilism. And so that's why they passed the navigation laws. If you remember, when they were passed, though, they weren't enforced on the colonies, but now, because of the Dominion of New England, they will be. It also limits manufacturing. It says that, now the South is not going to be manufacturing anything. We had talked about in a previous lecture that if you have money to invest in the South, you're going to invest it in cash crops because that's almost guaranteed return on your investment. But in New England, they have fast-flowing rivers, they have a lot of free workers, wage earners, and they have lots of resources. And because of their shipping, they have access to raw materials from the South and from the Caribbean. And so there could be manufacturing in New England. But the Navigation Acts expressly forbid any manufacturing to happen in New England. They want all the factories, if there are factories, they want them to be in Mother England, right? They don't want to be competing with factories from their own colonies. That would defeat the whole purpose of having colonies. Colonies is about generating wealth and having the wealth flow into England, not out of England. And so they limit manufacturing, so there shall be no manufacturing in the colonies. Now that's good for England, but it's going to be bad for New England, the American colonies, because this puts the colonies in the role of always being a resource gatherer. That New England's always just going to cut down trees for Mother England and not build any boats. The South is always just going to grow tobacco for England and not make any manufacturing. And that's bad because wealth will always be flowing away from the colonies to Mother England. Well, that's good for Mother England. That's why she created colonies, increase her pie piece. But we see that as long as mercantilism and the Navigation Acts are enforced, the colony's economy will always suffer. They'll always just be a raw material gatherer, and they will, by the way, also always have to buy their finished goods from Mother England. So think about that. When you gather a raw material, you do it at a very low price. Let's say you cut down some trees. Okay, so that lumber, you've just cut it down. That's all you've done to it. And so you're not going to be able to charge very much for it. And so you sell trees to England at a very low price. Then they make it into a boat, because only they can manufacture. And then England will sell those boats back to their colonies at a much higher price. So we see the overall wealth flow is going to England, and it's going to always make the colonies broke. Now, when we think about our next unit, when the colonies are going to want to rebel, that's one of the reasons they want to rebel, is because England will work the system that England always gets wealthy and her colonies will always remain poor and dependent. And the colonies don't want that to be their future forever. And so we see this is going to generate problems now and into the future in the relationship between the colonies and Mother England. Next, specie. Specie is money that is in the form of something tangible. It's not paper money. That's called fiat money. Specie is in the form of gold coins, silver coins, bronze coins, copper coins, something that already has value. It doesn't matter whose picture you stamp on it. And so England wants all of the specie in all of her colonies to flow to Mother England. That's why the colonies exist, to generate wealth for Mother England. And so let's say there are some gold coins circulating in Massachusetts or Virginia or Pennsylvania. England is going to force the colonists to pay for their manufactured goods that only England can make in specie, in coin. And so that means that whatever gold or silver or bronze or copper there is in the Americas eventually will get sucked up to Mother England, allowing them to have all the money and not the colonies. Obviously, this is going to make, if these are all enforced, which they now are going to be, this is going to devastate the colonies' economy, and it's going to make them very angry. So, who is the king going to put in charge of the Dominion of New England? It has to be somebody who's forceful. It has to be somebody who's going to get the job done. And so he puts into charge, the king puts in charge Sir Edmund Andros. Here we see a picture of him. Now, he is going to be in charge of the Dominion of New England, enforcing all of these navigation acts on the people of the colonies. Now, obviously, he's not going to be a very popular guy enforcing all of these taxes, regulation of trade, the specie, etc. And if you see on the right-hand side of the picture, there's a colonial, and he's shaking his fist at Sir Edmund Andros behind his back, and people are talking behind his back, because this man represents British imperial authority. He represents the destruction of the colonial economy just to benefit the British. And so the people of New England and New York and New Jersey are going to hate the Dominion of New England. They don't like having the era of benign neglect end. To make matters even worse, Sir Edmund Andros is going to headquarter his dominion in Boston. Well, this is a mistake because Boston is still a very puritanical town. And they have a tradition of, remember, town meetings, town halls, and democracy in New England. And this certainly, the Dominion of New England, is not democratic. The people of New England didn't vote for this Sir Edmund Andros guy to be in charge of them. And so this goes against their long tradition of self-rule during the era of benign neglect, and now they're being forced to do things. In addition to that, Sir Edmund Andros is a good Anglican. He believes that the Church of England is the best, and of course you remember when Massachusetts was founded, they were founded by Puritans who wanted to get away from the Anglican Church. So we also have some religious friction here going on. The people in Massachusetts are afraid that England is not only going to control them economically and politically, but now they may try to force their religion on them again. So lots of conflict. Next, In order to enforce his laws, Sir Edmund Andros brings some British redcoats with him. He brings some British soldiers. Now, these British soldiers, the rank and file soldier is typically taken from the very lowest part of society back in England. People who were poor, people who were in prison, and the only way they could get out of their prison sentence was to serve in the army. And so these people are now living in the heart of puritanical New England, in Boston. And so you can imagine there's lots of friction between these soldiers who are either Anglican or no particular faith in enforcing rules on these very puritanical, highly religious Puritans. So there's some friction there. Right? Andros is going now. When he comes in, he says, "Okay, you guys need to pay these taxes. You need to give us your specie. You need to do all these things." And the people of Massachusetts, they shake their fists at him. They resent him. They call him names. They say, "We're not going to do what you say we have to do." And so he takes matters even a step further. He says, "Fine, if you guys aren't going to do what I say," then he takes away freedom of the press. Now, the people of New England have had somewhat of a long history of being able to speak their minds in their town halls. So that's being challenged. He's going to enforce the Navigation Act laws, which have never been enforced before. He's going to replace colonial judges that are elected by the colonials themselves with English judges that aren't elected by the people. So it looks like democracy is going away, all in the name of being able to enforce these rules. Of course, this means there's no more era of neglect, and it's making people angry. Andros even goes so far as to dismiss the most cherished institution of all outside of the church, the local representative government that we're used to having during the era of benign neglect. He's going to dismiss the colonial assembly. And so now the colonials are really upset because they believe, this is Anglicization, the idea that ideas are going to spread from England to the colonies. Every Englishman, whether he's in England or the colonies, believes that he has the right to taxation with representation, and he has the right to make his own rules, either in direct democracy like town halls or in representative democracy like colonial assemblies. Every Englishman believes he has this right, and now it's being taken away from him. How come people in England have their parliament, but our colonial assembly has just been disbanded? It's just been dismissed. This isn't right. And so we see the relationship between England and her colonies is deteriorating because of the Dominion of New England. All right, so let's put the Dominion on hold for a minute and let's bounce back across the Atlantic. Let's go to something that happens in the Atlantic. It's called the Glorious Revolution. Now, King James, who is doing the Dominion of New England, he's not very popular even in England. King James is not popular because James, it's rumored, wants to turn England back into a Catholic country. And if you remember from our previous set of notes, England is a Protestant country. The Anglican Church is Protestant. Not all that different from Catholicism at the time, but still it is not Catholic. And so when it's rumored that he's going to try to get rid of Anglicanism and reinstate Catholicism, the people of England go a little nuts. They get angry. And so what they do is they rise up and they are going to kill James II, but he runs away. He leaves the country before he can be killed, like his grandfather, James I. And so England is without a king and a queen. Now, we don't want to go back to the time of Oliver Cromwell. We had a dictator. The people of England like their kings. And so what they do is they go back up the family tree and they try to find somebody that was related, that's still in line to inherit the throne. And what they do is they find William and Mary. And so they invite William and Mary over to England and they say, look, would you guys please be our king and queen? Of course, William and Mary, they weren't kings and queens before. They're just related to the previous line of kings. And they say, sure, but there's a catch. If you're going to be our king and queen, Parliament says, that's great, we need a king and queen, but you have to have some limits on your authority. And so we see that because of this, the English monarchy becomes a little bit more of a constitutional monarchy. Their power weakens and Parliament powers grow. That was part of the deal. If you want to be king and queen, you have to do what we say. Parliament is saying. And so there you have it. So we now have a king and queen back. We have a new rulers on the throne of England, but they're weak rulers. So what does this mean for the colonies? Well, when James II falls, his dominion is going to fall as well. People back in New England find out in Boston that King James has fled the throne, and so that, they think, gives them permission to rise up against his dominion. Obviously, no king, no dominion. And so here we see the people of England, or of New England and Boston. They have risen up and they have captured Sir Edmund Andros in the middle of the picture, and they've put him in irons, and they're marching him out of town. And so we see that the people of New England have risen up and rebelled against the old king's authority, which they think is fine because the new king and queen, it's not their dominion. They're not going to do anything to punish us for doing this. And even if they wanted to, King William and Queen Mary are very weak monarchs, and they really don't have the inclination or the power to go and punish the people of New England for rising up against them. And so what this creates is another era of neglect. We're going to have a series of relatively weak kings in charge of England who are content to leave the colonies alone again. So we have the era of salutary neglect. So we see kind of these bookends. In the first part of the 17th century, we have benign neglect, where England doesn't pay attention to her colonies in the Atlantic seaboard because they're just too weak and don't make enough money. And then we see in the middle, they do pay attention to them, the Dominion of New England, and try to enforce all these laws. And then by the end of the time period, they go back to a time period of neglect where the colonies can slide back in to only taxing themselves, to making their own laws, to having their own judges, to not having to follow the Navigation Acts again, and they're left alone. And everybody's happy with that for a while. But of course, that will not continue in our next unit when we talk about the American Revolution.